Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, and friend, John McKinnon, the author of The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician. And together, we're discussing Weaponized Religion, how Christian identity fused with early Christian fundamentalism and politics to form the foundation for the new Apostolic Reformation. John, today we have hit the epicenter for the combination of all of the research, the birth of what would become the NAR. I mean, this really, if you look back at this event, there are so many trails that lead back to this event. And I will never forget, I was working closely with, I'm not going to give his name, but a pretty big name in the message. He had sent me a tip that Roy Davis was later the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And I didn't believe it. I was like, no, there's no way. And I had all of the research of Davis's criminal past. I knew that he was at that time, I thought he was a two-bit leader of the 1915 Klan. I saw him holding public debates and that kind of thing. I did not know yet he was the second in command. But I kept researching, and I kept following the trail forward from, I guess it was around 1917, 1915, all the way up to, Roy Davis connecting with Branham. And then suddenly I discovered this thing that happened out in California, and I began scratching my head. Oh my gosh, this was like, in the grand scheme of the puzzle, it's like building two separate sides of the puzzle, and finally you find that one piece that connects everything together. And honestly, this was it.
Yeah, John, you're researched and finding that key, that piece of the puzzle that blew the whole thing open and started you on that trail for the research really has made a huge impact. And it does tie everything together. This becomes the epicenter, as you say, and we got several details here to share on this, on Davis's experiences in California. But it's the time when California was the hotbed of all this, and Pentecostalism, Christian identity, and all the revivalism going on. There was a lot of revivals up and down the coast of California. So there was a lot going on at this time. Plus the nation was involved in a war. And so it just came together, like you said, all coming together. We'll find out that Branham was hugely involved with this, and he was one that spearheaded the revival when he broke out onto the scene. So we'll find that he comes together, and there's very interesting things that happen between him, Upshaw, and Davis that connects the three together. And that, in my mind, it finally connected the three together. When I saw that, it just was no doubt that there was some issues going on here with this ministry. But Davis stays in California a while, then moves on to Dallas later on. We'll find out, and really gets the attention of the FBI. And he does appear in some documents because he tries to start the Ku Klux Klan again, calling it the Original Knights. And he also forms citizen councils, we'll find, and those were very instrumental and really big in trying to prevent integration and keep segregation going on. But he did this in several states. He's got Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and I think he's even in Florida later on in time.
Yeah, there's so much here that honestly we won't even be able to skim the surface. There are too many moving parts to all of this. But to lay the foundation, so we're approximately 1944 in the timeline. And 1944 was a pivotal moment in the United States. You had Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who the Christian identity movement had laid a finger on as what they believed to be the head of the Jewish conspiracy in the United States, and believed that whenever FDR was elected for a third term, they believed he was forming a dictatorship in the United States. And now the third term, by 1944, was turning into a fourth term, and Christian identity leader Gerald L.K. Smith rose to fight against this. He had minimal effect because he didn't win very many votes. But in California, where we're talking about, he was quite popular due to the fact that the Klan was being rebirthed as an opposition to this Jewish conspiracy, this alleged Jewish conspiracy. So out in California, you have leaders of the Klan and leaders of Christian identity working together. One of the most significant figures would be Wesley Swift, from which William Branham developed his two-seed, or he called it serpent seed doctrine. Swift became Gerald L.K. Smith's right-hand man in many ways and continued to carry that torch for years to come. And we have identified him working directly with Roy Davis in places like Little Rock, Arkansas, where the Little Rock 9 event would later happen. So we've got Swift, we've got Gerald L.K. Smith, you've got Davis, who is birthing the next wave of the Ku Klux Klan. Like you said, he's bringing it back to call it the original Knights. He sees himself as another William Joseph Simmons. He believes that he can birth the original movement. He believed that the movement had gone astray when they outed Simmons, according to Davis's themes. And so he was wanting to connect. He connected with William Upshaw, who is also a ranking member of the Klan, and they were going to birth it, but they needed money. And here lies the problem and the solution. And literally, this became the prototype for what religion and politics would do later. They found a way to get money. It wasn't quite on the up and up, but they were blending religion, politics, Christian identity, Klan, and honestly, they were laying the framework for many things that we'll see later in the NAR. The prophetic claims, you could even trace, to some extent, you could probably trace the Word of Faith movement because, as we'll get into this episode, it was largely influenced by what would come. So many trails, I can't even list them all for this episode, but it all happened right here in 1944.
Yeah, California, where Roy Davis was, he was in the news quite a bit. And in April of 43, it was Davis began organizing singing conventions and bringing the churches together. So that was really the start. And once he got there and married Allie Lee, they got their start, organizing these things. And these singing conventions were pretty popular. There were many groups that came to join that because everybody liked singing, and gospel singing was becoming real popular, Southern gospel and so forth in America. And so everybody would love to get together over that. So Davis wouldn't have been successful had he got together with his Baptist church and said, we're going to get the churches together. But by organizing singing conventions, it brought churches of all denominations together because they were very careful to say, we're welcoming everybody, anybody that wants to come and join us. So it was all going to be a front. So later on, he could promote his, white supremacy and, Christian identity, which a lot of them held anyway. A lot of those churches were a part of that anyway and held those type of beliefs. But he held conventions quite a bit, March and April of 1943, and organized and promoted Christian identity and white supremacy, but he was using the religious movement. Once he got the people together, he could get their names and they could all be joined together in one unified front. But it was all, the front was used to put this together. It was wartime. The America needed singing to help ease the stress of the war. So it all became a very good time for all this to happen and unite people and bring them together. And that's how Roy was able to do that there. And also to need money, like you said, they needed money to be able to pull this off. So Davis, he had tried this back in, I guess, Nashville or Knoxville, and while he was in Tennessee and maybe even in Louisville or Jeffersonville, but he always wanted to form an orphanage, and because he knows that orphanage can bring in money. Now, he definitely wanted to do that again, and they were able to get this resort, this closed down resort, and turn it into an orphanage to be able to raise the money. And he was able to find a benefactress named Elizabeth Usher. She was not married. I don't know if she was a widow, but she had quite a bit of money. She'd come into some money, I guess, through family, leaving her money. And he was able to get quite a bit of money back in those days from her, several donations, and she became the secretary of what they call the Davis Usher Foundation. And during that time, they took in a few children, and some of them were half orphans, they called them, because they had one parent living. But back in those days, I guess being hard times, the parents would, allow them to live in the orphanage so they could be raised. And so he took in only 9 children. But then Davis does something crooked to get more funds and money and even food. Back in those days when food was a little scarce and they even had to ration it, he misrepresented the number of children. So he inflated the number of children so he could get, all that money from the government. And then he got in trouble over that, we'll find. So he took funds from this wealthy woman under false pretenses. He pretended to be the FBI. And I believe Upshaw was very much involved in this because him and Upshaw was in touch. He was in touch with Upshaw at this time. Upshaw became the treasurer, I believe, of this foundation right before it sprang into and got in trouble with the law. Then Upshaw quietly got away pretty quickly, enough so that Davis said he doesn't have any contact with this organization now. I'm sure he was trying to protect Congressman Upshaw, because if Upshaw would have been arrested, it would have been bad publicity, and his days would have been over as far as speaking before the public. So his old friend from the Klan days were now back together. They were back together in the same, doing the same thing, just working together to promote their ideas.
And one thing key to mention in all of this, it's not just this developing latter rain, precursor to the latter rain movement that is connected to this. Upshaw was the vice president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and his ties to the Pentecostals, the Baptists, the fundamentalists, all of these different movements, they all knew Upshaw's name. When William Branham said, "Upshaw, I've never heard that name, I never knew who this was," it had to have been an outright lie, because Upshaw was one of the most popular men among all of this and connected directly to Davis. So there's no way that William Branham, working with Davis, would have not known Upshaw. In fact, there's a strong possibility that Branham was holding revivals with Upshaw and knew that he did not need a wheelchair whenever Upshaw was pushed to the stage, or, pushed into the revival to be allegedly healed while sitting in a wheelchair. But before we get into that, I want to go back to that singing convention, because for me, this is just eye-opening, and it's unbelievable. Me being a music fan, it holds even more interest. I grew up with, the National Quartet Convention, which I can't really trace it back to this being the origin, because there were other conventions. But to date, this is the largest singing convention that I've seen and witnessed. And there were big names of groups that I had records of these people going to meet with Roy Davis to sing at this convention. And in this article that's describing how Davis had established all of this network of singing conventions, it was actually an organization that was founded in San Diego by Davis. It is mentioned that he was a member of the original Stamps Quartet, another group that I grew up listening to. I heard J.D. Sumner and the Stamps. I had records of those. I played those constantly. J.D. Sumner was, I can't remember what year it was, but he held the world's record as the lowest bass singer known to man. He could go down to the bottom note of the piano, and I think it was either 3 or 7 notes below. He could actually go below the bottom note of the piano. And hearing that was just, for me, it was crazy cool. But so Davis sets up this convention, and there are a few key things to note. There are names that are dropped in this. Whenever it is mentioning the Stamps-Baxter Quartet, there are 4 names that are mentioned, and they're significant when you think of Christian identity. Davis obviously was of interest. Upshaw also was of interest, but it also lists William Jennings Bryan. And Bryan was the champion of this movement against the evolution. You can go to the Scopes trial. He was a big backbone to why the Scopes trial against evolution came to be. And the way it mentions it, there's a question for me as to whether or not those four people were part of the original Stamps Quartet. The fourth one being Dr. Caleb Ridley, who was the supreme religious chaplain of the Ku Klux Klan back when Davis was the second in command. It says that Roy E. Davis, Upland president of this convention, will be master of ceremonies. He was one of the original Stamps Quartet when it traveled out of Dallas, and which sang on Chautauqua programs featuring William Jennings Bryan, Congressman Upshaw, and Dr. Caleb A. Ridley. So the way it's written, it's very difficult. I've tried to go back and find records and see exactly what it meant. It sounds like that's the quartet, but it could also mean that Davis and his quartet sang on the Chautauqua trails with these guys. But at any rate, it's significant that those names are dropped, because as this thing is developing, these are key figures in how all of this would be birthed. And you can see some of that research if you go to my website. But there's a little phrase, and not many people would have caught it. There's a little, just one sentence news right underneath this article. It said youths under 21 accounted for 15% of all arrests for murder, 34% for larceny and robbery, and 50% for burglary in 1942, youths. So I read this, and, my mind just works like this. I saw this, and I'm like, well, that's an odd thing to say here in the newspaper. Why did they do that? And that led me down the trail of why Davis chose to set up this orphanage. This was one of the biggest problems in California at that time. The youth were turning evil, and not because they were just inherently bad, like most people back then probably thought. There was a large influx of orphans that came into California because of the war, of all nationalities. And there were so many coming in fact, that California was becoming inundated, and there was no place to put all of these orphans. And so you had orphans from overseas, you had orphans from California, you had this growing number of just children who their parents were so busy trying to just earn a living that they weren't getting proper parenting, and they were turning to crime, and some of it serious crime. When you think of 15% of all arrests for murder, that's a very high number for children. It's unbelievable, honestly. So Davis, when he's setting up this orphanage, he's setting it up at a time that California really needed orphanages. And that likely would have attracted Usher to participate in this because, oh my gosh, 15% of all murders were committed by children. So she invested in this, and we'll get into a little bit deeper the details of how she was snookered into this. But another key point of interest is that William Upshaw, former congressman and former presidential campaign leader, he ran under the Prohibition ticket. Upshaw convinced Usher that Roy Davis was a federal agent. And when I first saw that, I thought, well, it's just an outright lie. There's no way that, Davis is obviously not a federal agent. And with his criminal history, he couldn't be. But when you consider what the Christian identity movement during those years was doing, they believed, falsely, that the Jewish people had launched this plot to take over the world and had put FDR in. And so there was a rising underworld of government that was really rising up to overthrow the actual government in the United States. So Davis was being painted by all of these people in Christian identity as a federal agent going to overthrow the government. And when you think of the NAR's 7 mountain mandates, one of the mountains is government. This theme carries on for years and years and years. You can even find quotes from Branham where he's talking about how he spoke out so heavily against the government that they were going to arrest him. Well, in 1944, also you had the Great Sedition trial of all of these people who were siding with the Nazis over Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his policies. There's so many connections back to this, but to set the stage for all of this, the reason for the orphanage was significant. 15% of all murders were committed by children.
Yeah, that's right. I don't remember that phrase in the newspaper. It's good that you caught that, because it does mean a lot as far as why it was done. So I'm a little collector myself, and I was able to get the original photo from the internet. You can see here, this was the photo that appeared in the papers with Roy Davis and his orphans, his 9 orphans, not 75. And then also we have very few pictures of Davis himself, but I also have the original press photo of Mrs. Usher and Davis himself when she was accusing him, of the taking the money under false pretenses. But you can see all the stamps on the back. It's official. So these were the pictures they put in the newspaper, but I was able to get those, and just being a collector, I kind of keep those as mementos. But it's interesting that Congressman Upshaw, how they came together, and they had to. How could you even plan it any better than their old friends? Congressman is now 79 years old. He's getting to be an old man, and they live 25 miles from each other. I was looking on the maps from where Davis is in Upland and Congressman is in San Bernardino, California, but they're 25 miles from each other. That's not very far. It's they could spend time, fellowshipping a lot. So they were connected again. And Congressman was giving talks after the singing convention in March and April. He gave a talk at Los Angeles, the Church of the Open Door, in June, called "Who Shall Rule the World?" So you can see, as what you were saying, I'm sure it had something to do with the Jewish conspiracy, perhaps, and the communistic takeover of the United States, and FDR being in office and promoting it. So he was now speaking in churches about topics such as that. So that was one thing he did. And of course, Roy Davis starting his orphanage was another big thing. So in September, this is the orphanage was slated to open in September of 43. So they had a big opening and ceremonies, and the former Monte Vista Resort is where it was held at, and that was where they took over to have the orphanage. So Dr. John D. Williams of San Diego was named superintendent. Davis even said he was going to get instructors from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary to come and instruct there at the orphanage. I'm not sure how successful he would have been at that, but Roy Davis probably meant to use the orphanage, if he could have continued it, as more of an indoctrination tool, not only getting money, but using it to indoctrinate the children into his beliefs and values. Upshaw was taking an active part also, and he was to be in charge, believe it or not, for the Department of Americanism. It says that in the newspaper here. He was that was what he was going to be in charge of, and we know that Americanism was a buzzword, a term used in those days to speak of this very thing, Christian nationalism. It was another way to describe it, and so that was going on. And then all of a sudden, the things just fall apart. The Usher gets a little bit suspicious of Davis, because here he was posing as an FBI agent, and she was being eased out. She said that she was gradually being eased out of the organization. So not only did he get her money, he was trying to push her out. Once he got the money that she could offer up, then she was out. So Davis gets in trouble with the Office of Price Administration. That was an organization established in 1941 by the president to control money. It was price controls and rents after the outbreak of World War II to prevent skyrocketing prices. And so under that, you could actually get money for things such as orphanages and children. So when he inflated the number, they found out about it. An investigator found out, because they did investigate these things. They had to make it valid that you were actually getting money under the right cause. So it's the newspapers reported that orphanage gets too much money or too much food. Minister draws for 75 and has 9. So that's when it all started. It broke open around February of 1944. So here we are almost a year later, and he was arrested. At first, Allie Lee, his wife, was arrested, and others, and then they held him in there in the prison quite a bit. He was held in jail until the trial, and he was trying to get free on bond. But the fundraiser usher, she became disillusioned. It was being investigated by a police chief, and Miss Usher was questioned, and she just described herself as being disillusioned over the whole thing because it was being represented to her as a worthy cause, and so she was innocent in the whole thing. She wasn't guilty of the things Davis was. He was hiding everything from her and doing things under the cover. So as we get into this, after all these arrests, then Davis keeps getting charge after charge against him, not only from the food, but from taking money under false pretenses. And also there's this lady that were charging parents $35 a month. And Davis said at the opening ceremonies that we're going to do this free. We're taking in children without charging them. And that was the whole purpose for raising money. And Davis had been throughout the whole state of California on radio in various places to raise money for this orphanage. So by this time, he probably has a pretty good cash flow going and probably has a pretty good bank account. But they only mentioned this $8,500 that he gets from this usher is really what brought him down. But taking money from parents for $35 a month, that was, he was already they're supporting their own children, plus he's taking money elsewhere. So Davis was questioned by Mueller and after this arrest, he said Upshaw was not connected with the foundation at the present time. So there's Davis covering for Upshaw so he could just ease himself out and not be charged. But Davis received money from all over California who'd heard his programs and solicitations over a Riverside radio station. So then there was also a lady that charged him for taking the money that she actually sent to her son there. He was a half orphan. I guess the dad was passed away maybe through the war, but she had sent $1 a week to her son. And come to find out, Davis was pocketing the money. He didn't even bother to give him the money. He received neither the letter she sent nor the money. Now that sounds to me like the little boy was in prison. In prison they don't give you the mail usually if it's they don't want you to have it, and they definitely don't give you the money. But it sounds like it was a dictatorship. And so he got even more charges over that. So he was charged with stealing $1,000. She invested in the foundation, the usher invested, and then she made the complaint against him. That made the 8th complaint against Davis. So just all these things charged against Davis. And then Davis was charging that one of his associates there had stolen some money from him. So there was some back and forth. And then the trial started. So around April the 20th of 1944, Davis starts writing stories about how this orphanage came to him. He said it allegedly came to him after he had a vision, after he ate a peach. So that was reported in the papers. And I bet Davis relates this story because, the supernatural and signs and wonders were real big in the state of California with all the revivals going on. So he was doing that probably to get the sympathy of the jury that was going to be trying him. And he reports this vision, and he said it was a true story. And as we see, there's so much of that going on nowadays. People report they went to heaven and, met Jesus. They played and did whatever up there in heaven and came back down, and they got a free pass to go back and forth to heaven, or they have great visions or they're receiving this mantle from some minister that's passed away. So there's just so much of that going on. And this was the very start of it. We have people reporting false stories like this, that it just was the spearhead of all this whole thing. Branham was very famous for that. He spoke many things in his life story that were proven not to be true because actually Davis interjected in the Voice of Healing things that were contrary to his life story. So you don't really know what's true and what's not true anymore. And I think that's how it is today with all the stories going around with the churches. They just don't know, they have to believe their leaders, and they tend to believe those that set themselves up as apostles and prophets as their leaders. So they tend to believe all these wild stories. And there's been so much of that. But in 1944, in April, he ends up getting acquitted on several counts. It says 3 counts. He was acquitted on the charges of impersonating an FBI agent, 3 counts of that. And so little by little, Davis worms his way out of spending jail time here. It's amazing that he was able to do that. I don't know what arrangements they eventually had that made him become acquitted, but he did. These charges were dropped, and perhaps it was the sympathy he was able to get from the jury, through those stories.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take on it. This was a criminal organization, and what they were doing, make no mistake, they were funding the next wave of the Ku Klux Klan. To build the Klan, they had to have money. They were thinking of overthrowing the national government, so they needed weapons, and weapons cost money. And if you go through the history of what happened with the next wave of the Klan, they often use this type of strategy. One of the things that, it might have been you that told me, somebody else pointed it out to me, but the Louisiana Rifle Association, that was a funding operation for the Klan. And when people would give money to the LRA, then if the government were to have investigated, they could clearly say that they weren't funding the weaponization of a domestic terrorist group. They could say, no, I just donated to the Louisiana Rifle Association. And so their hands are clean. There's this separation between them and the really evil thing that's going on. Similarly, whenever people donated to the Orphanage, knowing what they were donating to, then they could say, I simply donated to an orphanage. I had no idea that this was a growing domestic terrorist organization. And we're not talking about small sums of money. You mentioned the numbers there, and the $1 a month, for example, that comes out to about $17 in today's money. So when you add those up, it's almost $100 a month that this person was giving, and this was just one of many people. When Miss Usher gave her, $7,500, I think it's over $150,000 in today's money. So that's a large sum of money. And Upshaw managed the books, according to that first article you read, and they were keeping two sets of accounting books. One where the money was actually going, which I don't think they ever fully identified where that book and where the ledger of where that money was going. But they did note that they had a witness that said there were two sets of books kept. So they were collecting money, they were funding the Klan. And as we'll get into future episodes, this was brought down and the Klan started funding in other ways. And it's really, really sketchy when you see what happened whenever Latter Rain was birthed, because William Branham, while going through all of these revivals saying, I never take an offering, and in the early days he dressed very, very fancy, but over time he got a little bit smarter and he started the Kentucky hillbilly dressing poorly stage persona, which was all an act. But in the earliest revivals, the newspapers were shocked that it took two very, very hefty men to carry the boxes of money from those revivals. And you look at the way Branham lived, the cars that he drove, even though some of them were fancy in the early years, you can't really account for the volume of money that flowed through those. Where was the money going? And we know that Branham was working directly with Davis. Branham had two significant mentors on his theology, one of them Davis, the other one F.F. Bosworth. And whenever you consider that Branham was working with Davis from as early as 1929, probably earlier than that, all the way up until he knows, as Davis is the imperial wizard of the Klan, the national imperial wizard, Branham knows his travel itinerary, when even the U.S. government doesn't know the itinerary of Davis, where he's going to be. So we know that he's working closely. We know that this large sum of money is going into the revivals, but yet, if you look at all the numbers, you can't account for it. And even when the IRS investigated Branham and tried to find where all the money went, they put a large, large number, which still doesn't account for all the money that he would have got. And it got paid off, from what I'm told. There's no record of what happened, but apparently the government got settled from another party. But at any rate, you had all of this money going in to this Usher Davis orphanage. It was clearly to fund quote unquote Americanism, which was the Christian nationalism, like you said. The Klan used it. All of these organizations in white supremacy used that term because they wanted to overthrow the government. Have you ever wondered how the Pentecostal movement started, or how the progression of modern Pentecostalism transitioned through the latter rain, Charismatic, and other fringe movements into the new Apostolic Reformation? You can learn this and more on William Branham Historical Research's website, william-branham.org. On the books page of the website, you can find the compiled research of John Collins, Charles Paisley, Stephen Montgomery, John McKinnon, and others, with links to the paper, audio, and digital versions of each book. You can also find resources and documentation on various people and topics related to those movements. If you want to contribute to the cause, you can support the podcast by clicking the Contribute button at the top. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe to the audio or video version that you're listening to or watching. On behalf of William Branham Historical Research, we want to thank you for your support.
I'm sure, like what you said, the money trail was a hard thing to follow, especially when you dealt in cash. And back then, the cash was worth a lot more than it is today by today's standards. And actually, that lady that sent her son $1, I think it was $1 a week. So you're talking about $100 a week, or that's quite a sum of money. And I'm sure Davis was glad to get that. But the Pentecostal revival was taken off about this time in 1945 to 47. Branham was getting his start about 1945 or earlier when he was becoming well known. And like you said, in the early days, I think he realized very early on when he started recording his sermons that the people were going to hear these sermons. So he had to present an image to the public of what he wanted them to know. And he learned these techniques from Davis very long time ago, back in the 30s, that what you present in the papers, what you write about, people are going to read it, and it's going to become the truth to them. So early on, he was written about in the newspapers as being nattily dressed. He appeared, I believe it was when he was with Avak Hagopian. He wore these white suits like the little David Walker did, and they tended to wear suits like that looked, pretty well dressed. And he even talked about his watch, I guess, that would stop when the gift was operating, and it would be a very expensive watch, and what I would probably never buy. It might be like a Rolex. But he quickly got away from that. I'm sure after he read the papers, and maybe some people probably told him, "You got to change your appearance here because you're being seen as a rich man," and which he was. So he began to hide his wealth, and he hid it for a long, long time. And the IRS, like you said, finally caught up with him, in the 50s, and he was owing a lot of money by that time. I mean, he had taken all these checks, and he said he ran them through his organization. He signed off on them, but I'm sure a lot of the money went to him. And to me, very little of it went to the actual organization. If you look at how he promoted, if we could go into that detail at some time, how he promoted his India trip coming up to South Africa, India. He was taking offerings all over the United States. He would mention the vision he had of going to India with the 300,000 souls that was to be saved. And he was taking offerings everywhere because and on tape, you'll hear him say, "Thank you for your offering. It's all going to go to foreign missions." But the trip that actually went, it was no more than a team of, 4 or 5 people and maybe an airplane, a hotel bill. And so how much money does that take? It wasn't a big convention, and they had the convention in basically a church. So but all the money he took over all the United States, where did that go? That was something that was, I'm sure it went into his organization and made him, pretty wealthy from all that. Then he had to come back after the failure of that and try to explain and try to make it sound like that it was a great meeting, when in fact it was much smaller and didn't cost as much as what he took in. So the money trail, very hard to follow, but we know that William Branham took many expensive hunting trips. He was widely traveled. I mean, going to Colorado, Montana, New York, upstate New York to hunt. Those things take a good bit of money, even back in those days. So in February of 1951, Upshaw being kind of out of the picture after this orphanage blew up, he came back into the picture in 51 several years later. We'll mention pretty briefly, but he was sent to the meeting. Even Branham mentions this, sent to the meeting by Roy Davis. Now, to me, when these things came together, you got Branham on tape saying, "I never knew Upshaw," but it was Roy Davis that sent him to the meeting. So why was Upshaw and Davis together again? Davis being the head of the Ku Klux Klan, and then Upshaw knowing they were connected back in the 30s, and then Branham saying he never knew him. And all he did was relate a vision. And here we got a sermon here that he preached in 1954 talking about seeing a boy playing on a haystack. So he describes this vision that he supposedly had in the meeting, and was seeing the man get out of the wheelchair and start walking. So that is exactly, what he used as, they're using these visions, these experiences to convince the audience that, hey, I really saw something. When actually under the scenes, behind the scenes, he actually knew the man. He actually had very much acquainted with him. There's just no way with him being so connected to Davis and that being his first pastor that he wouldn't have never heard of Upshaw. So anyway, Branham has this story about how he came in the wheelchair, and then how he seen him in the vision, and then how he raised up out of the wheelchair. So that was, to me, the linchpin for me is when that all came together, and seeing, how that was probably fake, because Upshaw was very much not using his crutches too much, even back in the 20s when he was in Congress. By that time, his injury had gotten healed enough to where he could generally lightly touch his crutches to the ground and get around pretty good. So that would really was the linchpin for me. Now, Davis remained in California probably until the 1950s because of that meeting in 51. And then, of course, he moved back to Texas and continued to work within the churches. He worked within these organizations. He, like you said, started the original Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, trying to get that revived. And then other white supremacy circles. He was never stopped his fight with that. It was all over the Southeast and Texas, Louisiana, Florida, and then eventually reconnecting with Branham, because Branham mentions him on tape several times in the 50s and 60s about him even being in the meetings. And during this time, you mentioned Wesley Swift. He was becoming the chief propagandist for Christian identity, and Swift influenced Gerald L.K. Smith, who became a right-wing political operative and started spreading the doctrines as well. But like you said, wasn't very successful, but did make a run for trying to get into government, get into politics, so he could have an influence in politics. But all this came at the time. The U.S. was under fear of communism, Hitler's rise to power, taking over the world, the Jewish influence, all of that came together. And then Branham, of course, in the 50s starts mentioning his prophecies where he said he saw, Roosevelt rise to power and bring us into a war and things like that. So it all came, there's another vision. There's another, and as we see as the visions changed over time, there's no credibility to it. Him saying it was written on a piece of paper and the paper's never produced, or him saying the visions were put in the cornerstone of the tabernacle of his church and it was never found. So we see how this was a spearhead of all these things going on today with the NAR and these the charismatic world, the ones that are not true, the ones that are making up stories just to build up their credibility before the audience so they could be some type of great prophet or apostle. They've got to come up with some great story to build their spirituality, because behind the scenes, they don't have a lot of spirituality to them. How could they when they don't live the life, that's the way it's written in the Bible, the way Jesus would want them to live.
So here's where it gets weird. You've got all of these connections, and, like I said, from a historical standpoint, from a doctrinal standpoint, from just simply connecting people and movements, this is the epicenter, and we could literally spend 2 whole episodes talking about all of the many connections back into this event. But here's where it gets weird. So Davis escaped all of the charges. Upshaw he came out so clean that you can't even find him mentioned once it turns into a criminal trial. And in the United States, you're innocent until proven guilty. And once you go through the court of law, it is assumed that you're innocent because the jury of your peers found you to be innocent. However, those lines get really, really blurred when you consider the fact that in the 40s, as they're birthing the Klan, as all of these people think that the United States government has been overtaken by a Jewish conspiracy, and judges, attorneys, many in the jury pool, all of these people are now a tainted jury pool, and they're all, not all, but many were members of the growing and developing Klan or Christian identity, or at minimum adherence to it, because this was dominating California at the time. So Davis escapes almost clean, and he actually sued Los Angeles, and he got a large sum of money for it. But also at the same time, in this area in Los Angeles, you had the Kardashian family, which had immigrated into the United States, and they were deeply, deeply involved with the early Pentecostal movement. They believed in prophecy, so we can't connect them directly to Davis, but there's so many trails that we can point out the fact that they had to have been connected based off of the history that developed after this. The Kardashian family, you mentioned Avok Hagopian, they sponsored Avok Hagopian to come into the United States. They also sponsored Clem Davies and promoted his ministry. Davies was a Klan recruiter from California, open white supremacist. He was in many of the conferences that Wesley Swift would have been in, and I think it's Gordon Lindsay. I can place him in a conference with Gordon Lindsay, where Lindsay was the speaker, a Christian identity conference. So the Kardashian family are sponsoring Christian identity people. William Branham says the same people that sponsored Hagopian sponsored my ministry. And that, for me, that raised the biggest question. So here's William Branham, who claimed to be this hillbilly nobody from Indiana. How in the world did the Kardashian family hear his name? Well, they're in Los Angeles at the same exact time that Roy Davis and his highly publicized trial is in Los Angeles. Davis is building the Klan up, and the Kardashian patriarch's nephew, Demas Shakarian, starts the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association. It is the one entity, after everyone else abandoned William Branham in the latter years, it is the one single organization that continued to sponsor Branham's meeting. And you mentioned Branham going to all these different countries and how he over-exaggerated all of the revival numbers. Well, Branham himself mentioned that he was helping plant FBGMI organizations in multiple countries. So he's doing this. At the same time, he's working with people like Baron Frere von Blomberg, who is involved into the cult that's called the Family, that hosts the National Prayer Breakfast, which, if you think about the government and politics and religion, all of that blend of weirdness that's happening, all of this is connected, and you can trace it all back to this 1944 event where Davis is out here wooing all of the religious, the political, the Christian identity, the Klan, all of these various movements. And they set the standard for donating large sums of money to the Christian organizations. So if you think the Word of Faith movement, you think the prosperity gospel, all of this, there's only a few different ministries that I can see that were prior to this, that large of a sum of money was coming in. You can go back to A.B. Simpson, which was also he was also tied to all of this through various connections that we'll probably get into later. He was collecting very, very large sums of money, and he too kept 2 sets of accounting records. So it seems Davis took that same strategy, and he set up his 2 sets of accounting records, one going to the Klan, one going to this orphanage. And now you bring in the Kardashian family, which brings the lights, camera, action, entertainment, focus, and agenda to this thing. And honestly, I can look at the patriarch's eyes lighting up with the dollar signs, because this was a good way to bring in money. And no matter the cause, whether it's Christian identity and he agreed with it or not, I'm not going to say he did or didn't. If he were just to take a percentage of that money, he would become a very rich man. And we see what happened with the Kardashian family. So we can see that there was a lot going on here, just to say the least.
Yeah, I would say there was so many things coming together, and it was just a unique time. And these men were very skilled in what they were doing. It's amazing that you had this kind of group that they all had the same, they come together in their core belief systems, and they were all able to work together. It didn't matter what denomination they were from, because really that was just a front for what they were really wanting to do underneath. So I think my thoughts here just now was that the conspiracy was within this group with Davis and all of them working together. That's where the real conspiracy was, rather than a Jewish conspiracy to take over the government. So they were here trying to point to a conspiracy outside of themselves, when they were really conspiring to do all these things within our own government, and it was very, very evil at the time. And these groups were very skilled. They knew what they were doing, and the power of the media and the power of these things and these meetings they were having. They were actually creating the worldview of people. The worldview that we had in our minds. That's why once that's solidified in your mind, it is very hard to disconnect from that, because you tend to believe this is how I see the world. And we talked about years ago, coming out of the message, we have cognitive dissonance. Well, once you've implanted those beliefs into somebody's mind and you have a worldview, anything coming against that is very hard to change your mind. So this worldview is being created in the minds of the people, mostly white Christians, the Pentecostal, charismatic world. So it's been created by all these things. They've thrown in the Jewish conspiracy, communism, Christian identity, end of the world, and then at that time the flying saucers, and we know how Gordon Lindsay published that. People were just remaining in fear about what's coming next. And so once you got them under that cloud of fear, then they're looking to their leaders. Well, you're hearing from God, so you're the prophet. You're hearing from God. Tell us what we need to do. And that's what's happening today, is people are looking to other people to tell them what to do. And I guess that's what helped birth the shepherding movement, right out of this very thing. The shepherding movement and with the NAR, with the churches there, they set themselves up in what they call the fivefold ministry of the apostles and prophets, and they're in charge of the church. So they're really in charge of the worldview of the people. That's a very dangerous thing, because as you look back to the days of Jim Jones, and as he came out of this very thing, he set himself up as being the man. So whatever he said, was their worldview. So he convinced 1,000 people just to take their lives. We see that happen in Africa. Most recently, the man that was, of course, we believe Jesus is coming soon, but you don't go out and starve yourself and kill yourself just so you can be with Jesus. We're supposed to stay on this earth and be a light to the world until he comes, not to go kill yourself so you can go early. God holds life and death in his hands, not us. So all these things are being birthed from this very movement here, because it's very dangerous to give these men power over your mind. So the only thing that Christians need to look to is the Word of God, and pray to God directly, not to trust any man. We shouldn't put our trust in man. But it gave these Christian identities believers and the latter rain Pentecostals a way to make sense of the world. And all this coincided with World War II, end of the world prophecies, things that were coming. So they always kept the people guessing, the end of the world's coming. They always set dates too, as we saw it even in message churches, and Charles Paisley mentioned this. They always would set a date where they thought the rapture was occurring. But it's happened throughout all of the churches that are into that. They do set dates, and then they don't come to pass, but they still remain with their leader. So the 1950s had that huge influence there with all these things, and it was all involved the groups wanted to keep the races separate, segregated, and also the integration of black people in schools. They wanted to stop that and have separate schools. So even Branham mentions that on tape. A lot of times he'll say it's better, the woman that actually said, I want to keep my children out of the white schools, she actually had a good idea. That was his idea, is that, hey, it's better for you to stay separate. He seemed to go along with that. And Davis led these groups. One was called the White Citizens Council. They actually called them Citizens Councils. And that was in Dallas, Texas. And And he also was involved with the Mothers League. That was on an FBI document I found. There was a thing called the Mothers League. And the Mothers League, that was a council set up by this mother to be, it was an important segregationist organization during the Little Rock Central High School desegregation. It was established in 1957 by a salesman, Merrill Taylor, and other members of the Capital Citizens Council. That's one of those white citizens councils to give birth to that. And then the League combined traditional segregationalist enthusiasm for the racial status quo, states' rights, and anti-miscegenation initiatives. And then anti-miscegenation means interracial marriage. They didn't want that. So that was Margaret Jackson eventually took that over, but there's an FBI document that mentions, Margaret Jackson and Davis being connected. And so they use these organizations really to fight integration. One thing I came across that was really interesting, I don't know if you've ever heard of this minister, but he was in Texas, Dallas, Texas, the pastor of the First Baptist Church of West Dallas, Texas. He published a pamphlet called God, the Original Segregationalist. He was highly racist pastor in Dallas, and he published it after a series of sermons. He compiled them all together and published this pamphlet in 1955. And it found be very popular amongst the conservative white Christians in southern states who were opposed to the integration. And even the Dallas Morning News published it, an abridged version of the pamphlet, in August of 1955. And Roy Davis's councils distributed it amongst their network. So it went throughout all the network. And believe it or not, Daniel himself, Kerry Daniel, the pastor there, he was actually a vice chairman of the Dallas chapter of the Texas Citizens Council. And of course, Davis was the president of that. And it says here, over a 10-year period now, this pamphlet sold 1 million copies. Can you imagine 1 million copies going out amongst the southern states there? And the pamphlet was later published in a collection of sermons. So Kerry Daniel had a very widespread influence when he wrote this pamphlet. I can't even read it because it would be so hateful to read what's in it, but you can get copies off the internet today. It's very easy to get, just do a search. But it's a very highly racist set of sermons that he published, and it's so bad I couldn't even read what's there. But interestingly enough, while segregation was going on, Branham, of course, was mentioning that in his sermons. He mentions in 1961, up in British Columbia, he says, come out from among unbelief. This was in May 20th, a sermon called From That Time. He said, separate yourself, segregation. God is a segregationalist, called Israel out. He called his people out. The very word church means called out. Now, he's a segregationalist. God don't want his children mixed up with the world or things of the world, but they had the baby just the same. So he was not really saying outright, overtly, that we need to keep the races segregated, but he did say that he was not for interracial marriage. So obviously he was for the principles of segregation, while not openly admitting it in his sermons there, but he did mention segregation a lot. In 1964, in December, in Yuma, Arizona, he mentioned God, the Word in the beginning, he was independent from all everything else, all other people. I don't mean to say this to be different. God is a segregationalist. You know that? You talk about integration. God's a segregationalist. He certainly does. So, even his sermons, Branham sprinkled in things like that. And I think under the scenes, people more or less knew what he was talking about because of his serpent seed doctrine and because of his preaching against interracial marriage and because of all the other groups that was associated with him, such as Davis's and the Pentecostals that were associated with all the Christian identity. I think it was very well known what he was really referring to there about being segregated, and his very being for, not integrating the schools. I mean, by him saying that the woman was right when she said she didn't want to see the schools integrated, he was definitely not for the integration of schools as well. So that's about where we are. It's a hotbed going on. It's a lot of tensions in the nation, and now that the war is over, and even the Korean War that was fought to 1953, it's over. So in the mid-50s, you've got a lot of tensions building in America over racial integration.
I get often asked, what does all of this matter? Because we live in 2024, and all of this happened, we're talking about things that happened in the 1940s. And people say, yes, that history exists, but that history exists among all of the denominations, and you can find bad people among all of them. And the irony is that the people who are saying this, many of them are either in the Branham cult or the NAR. And so they're equating the bad people with, William Branham and these figures that we're mentioning. But all of that aside, it's very important. You have to understand that these leaders in the NAR, they obviously see that William Branham's pattern that he established, and he established it largely because of the influence of Roy Davis. They want to mimic this. They see that it gains power, sex, and money. And that's usually one of the three is how these people are going to fall. And I don't know if people have caught it yet or not, but in some of the videos I've been putting out, I have identified key figures in the NAR who are actually taking Branham's sermons and copying them not verbatim, but structurally from start to finish. And if you examine their sermon, and I can pull up the Branham sermon that they're copying it from, you can see that they are clearly plagiarizing William Branham, not realizing that at least one of the same sermons, Branham was plagiarizing another person. And so there's this weird trail of plagiarization that happens. So people here today in 2024 are plagiarizing William Branham, and the sermons that they're copying, these are Christian identity sermons that include some very, very, very hateful statements. And the answer that I give these people, so the people who contact me in the message, they'll say, William Branham wasn't racist. He had black people in his congregations, and he spoke highly of black people. But he also spoke highly of segregation, and he also spoke out of both sides of his mouth. And one of his core doctrines came from this white supremacy, the serpent seed doctrine. It is clearly establishing the notion that people with black skin cannot marry people with white skin, or their offspring cannot go into heaven. William Branham says for 15 generations they can't, which is a racist thing to say. You don't say this if you're not a racist. And like you said, the influence is long-lasting. I grew up hearing sermons from ministers who have congregations that write into me and say, yes, you're talking about Christian identity, and a lot of these people may have been connected, but we no longer discriminate against Jews in the cults today. But I've heard sermons from ministers who use the word Jew as a verb, and it's usually used as a verb about conniving people out of money. That's usually what they're using it for. I grew up listening to sermons like this, and in my head, I've heard so many of those sermons that sometimes, if I'm not careful, it will almost slip out of my mouth because it was a verb I heard continually, not just from ministers, but also from family who are also ministers. So this is a very bad thing that they're teaching people, and they're continually teaching this today. In fact, one of the leaders of the NAR, I did share a video of this, and I think I've got the person's face, but he used the term false Jew against Ruth Ginsburg. And the false Jew, that whole phraseology comes from this Christian identity movement. It is the notion that a set of false Jews have invaded government. So, he is clearly identifying himself as a Christian identity minister, and it's a key figure in the NAR. You can tie him to multiple churches and multiple organizations that are spreading this type of hate. So I could go on forever. We've got so many connections. They all come back to this Epicenter, this 1944 Epicenter in Los Angeles. But it grows from here. So where we go from here, John, honestly, there is not enough, there's not enough hard disk space in all of the computers to contain all of the podcasts that we could do off of where this went. But in the end, if you look at the NAR today, if you look at the Charismatic movement that birthed it, look at Word of Faith, look at the health and wealth gospel and how that transitioned to the prosperity gospel, you get all of these movements that developed right here from 1944 the epicenter of the merging of Christian identity, religion, politics, white supremacy, and the list goes on. So I'm excited for the next episode, which we'll get into and hopefully untangle that a bit. If you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more information about Roy Davis and William Branham, you can read The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician. For more about the dark side of latter rain, read Weaponized Religion, From Latter Rain to Colonia Dignidad, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.